Church. At the Council of Florence, 1441, Pope Eugene IV held the same. And at the Council of Trent, finally, this was made a dogma. In the 7th session of the Council of Trent, on the sacraments in general, the Canon 13 reads, "If anyone was to say that the traditionally handed down rites used in the solemn administration of the sacraments can be held in disdain or be shortened or be changed into new ones by whomsoever of the pastors of the churches, may he be cursed." If anyone was only to say that, he would already be outside the church and cursed. And the Latin word for whomsoever is absolutely without a second meaning. It is very clear. The Latin word quiscumque. You can look that up in the dictionary if you don't trust me. The Latin word quiscumque, in classical Latin as in medieval Latin, has only one translation. And the translation is whosoever, brackets, no exception granted. Whosoever. Quiscumque is absolutely exclusive. Now, whosoever of the pastors of the churches includes the Pope. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome, the Archbishop of Latium, the Primate of Italy, the Patriarch of the West. That's a lot of pastors in one person. So anyone, whosoever of the pastors of the churches includes the Pope. Even my friend Thomas A. Nelson, 10 books, has that translated wrong, probably not his fault, in the documents of the Council of Trent, where it says every pastor. Quiscumque cannot be translated with every. Every would be something like quisque or omnes, but quiscumque means whosoever. The Council of Trent fathers knew Latin. They were not like the fathers at Vatican II who didn't know a thing about Latin. At the Council of Trent, the only language used was Latin. They didn't speak anything but Latin. Of course they spoke Italian. They spoke Italian when they were running over for a coffee. But in the Cathedral of Trent, Latin was spoken. And everybody back then knew his Latin. And when they formulated that canon, believe me, they were back then, they took the truth seriously. They were fighting over every single word. And if the word quiscumque was chosen, that meant the Pope too. To choose the word quiscumque was like saying right in the Pope's face, that means you too. And that's absolutely in accordance with church tradition, as you will see, because Gregory the Great became Pope in 590. Shortly after he became Pope, he added the words, Diesque nostros in tua pace disponas to the hanc igitur. May you dispose of our days in your peace. The population of Rome almost killed him for that. Said, how dare you touch the sacred canon? That was 590 something. The church back then was very well aware of the necessity of tradition. St. Cyril of Jerusalem said, is it tradition? Ask no more. Means it's tradition, fine. It's not tradition, discard it, forget it. The Fathers of Trent therefore said that the Pope could not change the rites. Is that my interpretation or is it papal teaching? It is implicit papal teaching because have you ever held a Roman Missal in your hands? Well, if you get a chance, look up the first decrees at the beginning of the book. At the beginning of the Roman Missal, you will find the decree Quo Primum by Pius V. And as the only exception in church history, you will not only find Pius V's decree, but you will find 3 other decrees. All through church history, no pope published a book without canceling his predecessor's document if there was one. The typical way, for example, of publishing the Code of Canon Law or the Corpus Juris Canonici, that was the predecessor before 1916, would be to authorize a new edition and put in one's document, like Pope Urban IX would put in his name and throw out his predecessor's decree. The Roman Missal, since 1570, is the only exception in church history. Why? Because Pius V did nothing else but respect the Council of Trent when he codified what was there. When Pius V, Saint Pius V, in 1570 published the Roman Missal, he did not change anything. He changed a few little rubrics that were kind of, how do you say, they were not clear. They were kind of confusing, and so he changed them. But the book as such was the missal that had been used for centuries by the Roman Curia. And he canonized it with the decree quo primum, in which he says, not only the book must never be changed in the future, this Mass must be said by all priests in the future, but the decree as such is irreformable. Some people now argue that the Pope cannot bind the Pope. They argue in what you call legalistic nonsense. They quote Roman law and they misquote Roman law, because they quote Roman law well, but they quote Roman law on a wrong level, by quoting the old line, par in parem potestatem non habet. An equal has no power over an equal. The Pope, at first sight, may seem another Pope's equal. But then, how about the dogma of the Immaculate Conception? Can a future Pope take that back? No, you know very well he can't. So that means that the popes have to respect their predecessors. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what the old oath of our incoronation says. Don't be mistaken by the fact that the oath of incoronation was signed in writing by the popes only between the year 781 and 1302. But the text of the oath of incoronation is still today to be found in that singular collection of rights that pertain only to the Pope called Liber Diurnus Romanorum Pontificum. The text is still there. No Pope has ever contradicted that text. We are talking about basically 1500 years approved theology. That means it's the faith of the Church that the Pope cannot change things. There, in the oath of incoronation, it says, if I was to betray the handed-down tradition of my predecessors, God shall not be a merciful judge to me at the last judgment. So tradition binds the Pope, especially in liturgy. Why? The oldest liturgical principle that has been written down the first time in the year 250, exactly 1750 years ago, is Lex orandi statuat legem credendi. The law of what has to be prayed will determine the law of what has to be believed. Do not confuse the law of what has to be believed with the deposit of faith. The deposit of faith is at the very beginning of everything. But the law of what has to be prayed, that is the Roman Missal, for example, will determine the law of what has to be believed. What is the law of what has to be believed? The Creed, for example. Every time you recite the Creed at Sunday Mass, at the same time you recite what you have to believe in order to remain a Catholic. Now, in the liturgy, you always found the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. You talk about Lex orandi, the law of what has to be prayed. In an ancient missal of the 14th century, or in a handwritten missal of the 8th century, you will find the Feast of the Immaculate Conception on December 8th. That's the law of what has to be prayed, because the priests had to celebrate that feast. However, it only became the law of what has to be believed in 1854, when Pope Pius IX proclaimed the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. So you can easily see in history that the law of what has to be prayed will determine the law of what has to be believed. Lex orandi statuat legem credendi. Until Pope Pius XI included, no pope ever misquoted that line. So for uninterrupted 1600-something years, we had the popes quoting the same line in the same way, always saying the same thing. Then Pius XII in 1947 turned this line around, which I don't think he had the right to do. It's a theological mistake, but it's not our topic today to talk about Pius XII. You can see from this principle that the Roman Missal cannot be considered a mere disciplinary law. It is much more than that. It is way above any discipline. The Roman Missal is the #1 law of what has to be prayed, because Holy Mass is the #1 prayer. Therefore, when Pius V said this Missal cannot be changed, and this decree confirming that is irreformable, he did in fact bind his successors. I ask you, is this my interpretation or is it the Pope's? Well, I showed you that is the papal interpretation, because even John the 23rd did not dare to take out quo primum or the decree followed with, by Clement VIII or the decree by Urban VIII. He did not dare to replace these documents. That means even John the 23rd visibly thought that he was bound by his predecessors' decrees. That makes 400 years of popes being bound, who felt, quote unquote, that they were bound. Of course, the popes didn't just have a feeling about it. Leave the feelings in California. In the Vatican, you have theologians to discuss things like that. Every single pope, before he writes a decree, will ask his cardinals and his theologians on how to write it. Very few popes ever were proud enough to think that they could single-handed write decrees. And that shows you why the new rite, which Paul VI himself called Novus Ordo Mass, the new order of Mass, is not a work of the Church. And it cannot be considered the Latin Roman Rite, because the Latin Roman Rite is bound in the old Roman Missal. So what do you call it? Well, I call it a schismatical new rite. Why? Why? What does schism mean? Literally, in Greek, schisma means to cut, a cut somewhere. Schism, to go into schism, means you cut yourself off the Church. You do not split the Church, as John Paul II says, or wants you to believe. You cut yourself off the Church. You cut yourself off from the Church. You leave the Church, in short. A schismatic act is not necessarily a formal schismatic act by declaration, so that you're really to be considered a schismatic, but it is something that cuts off something of the Church. Now, against Church tradition and against the Council of Trent, against quo primum, and against the interpretation of 400 years of papacy, Paul VI wrote up a new rite. Therefore, that has to be considered a schismatic rite. If it is a schismatic rite, it cannot be considered the Roman rite. If it's not the Latin Roman rite, but a schismatic rite, you cannot apply Pope Pius XII's decree Sacramentum Ordinis to examine its validity. You will have to examine the validity of the Novus Ordo rite the same way the Church has always examined the validity of schismatic rites. How did the Church go about it? Now, the last one to go into a thorough examination of schismatic rites was Pope Leo XIII in 1894 in his decree Apostolicae Curae, in which he decides that Anglican orders are not valid. How did he go about it? First of all, he studied the history of the Anglican rites, as we all, willingly or not, have studied the history of the Novus Ordo. as we are witnesses to its, most of us are witnesses to its publication. Most of us are witness to the disaster it caused. And most of us are witnesses to the heresies and the apostasies that are a result of the Novus Ordo Mass. The second thing to examine was the matter. That hasn't changed in the Novus Ordo, it's no problem. The third thing to examine was the form of the sacrament. That has changed. It has changed, especially in Mass and at ordination. Before we examine the validity of ordinations, I will shortly tell you what I think about the validity of the new Mass. It's not our topic really today, but as long as bread and wine is used, we have no reason to discuss the matter. How about the form? Now, in Latin, the essence of the words are still kept, not in the translations. In Latin, it says, hoc est enim corpus meum in the old rite, and hoc est enim corpus meum quod pro vobis tradetur in the new rite. For the chalice, the only thing that changed was that the Mysterium Fidei is kept out, which is not essential to the transubstantiation. Moral theology has never held that in the days before the Council. The problem is the translations. In the Latin original, it says, hic est enim calix sanguinis mei novet aeterni testamenti mysterium fidei qui pro vobis et pro multis effunetur in remissionem peccatorum. Christ gave his blood for the many, not for all. In the English translation it reads for all. In the German translation, the same, für alle. In the Italian translation, per tutti. In the Spanish translation, per todos. In all the translations except the Polish translation of all, the translation changed from for the many to for all. How do you judge such a change? There's two ways. First of all, you look up old moral theologies. In the old moral theologies, you will find that many moral theologians say it is enough for the validity of Mass to say, this is my body, and then to say, this is my blood. That is something to be looked at very carefully. What was the problem they discussed? When you find a moral theologian given an answer to a problem, you also have to ask yourself, what was the problem he discussed in the first place? Now, the problem was accident. What happens if an old priest is saying Mass? While he says Mass, he gets kind of sick, but he continues with Mass. At the consecration, he pronounces the words of consecration over the bread. Then he picks up the chalice, and he starts to pronounce the words of consecration over the chalice. And all he manages to say is, hic est enim calix sanguinis mei, and that moment he drops dead. Now that is a problem. What is it now? Wine or the blood of Christ? What is it? So moral theologians had to examine that problem. And within that context, they said, with the utmost probability, it is the blood of Christ. And that's why you read in the old moral theologies that it is the blood of Christ. However, the point is, we are talking about a problem within the frame of the traditional liturgy. We are not talking about a problem outside it. What if you talk about something outside the traditional liturgy? What if you talk about something outside Mass? Now, as you will see when we discuss the intention of the sacrament of a sacrament always has to be to do what the Church does. Not to do what the Church wants, or to do what the Church did, or to do what the Church will do in the future, but to do what the Church does. What is it what the Church does? Well, what the Church has always done is what the Church does. What the Church has always outlawed is what the Church does not. In the Code of Canon Law, be it the new Code of Canon Law or the old Code of Canon Law or all the books before, it says to attempt to consecrate outside Mass is nephas, sacrilege. Nephas is a very strong Latin word, derived from fas, F-A-S. Fas is divine law. Nephas, therefore, is not divine law, the contrary of divine law. Therefore, something extremely evil. So, the canon in the Old or the New Code of Canon Law should be translated: to attempt to consecrate outside Mass is extremely evil. It is not the purpose of a law book to define if that is possible. It's only the purpose of a law book to say if it's allowed or not. Now, if the Church for 2,000 years has called the attempt to consecrate outside Mass a sacrilege, then you cannot say the Church does it. That means if I was to play a terrible joke on our Lord, and if I attempted to consecrate the wine contained in this carafe, nothing would happen, because it's outside Mass, except that I would be in mortal sin. But otherwise, nothing would happen. So you have to see the difference between the context of outside Mass and the context of within the traditional frame of Mass. Therefore, I side against those who say, with the old moral theologians, that it is sufficient to say this is my body and this is my blood in order to have the sacrament take place. And I side with those who say that the new Mass in English is not valid because in the Roman Missal, in De Defectibus, it says so. I agree with that. In the Roman Missal, at the beginning of the Roman Missal, there is a decree, usually 2 pages, that speaks about what happens if something goes wrong at Mass. De defectibus in celebratione missarum occurrentibus. That decree was published and signed by Pope Pius V in 1571, 1 year after the Missal came out. And there it says, if the celebrant was to be distracted or interrupted at the words of consecration, and if these shortened or changed words of consecration contain a change of significance, and if the celebrant does not repeat the words of consecration fully and correctly, the sacrament does not take place. Now, to change for the many to for all, as you can easily see, is a change in significance. And please do not say, like some learned scholastic scholars, pseudo-scholastic, pseudo-scholars say, that in antiquity they didn't know the difference between many and all. That's absurd. That is to deny reason to all antique cultures. In all the antique languages, you will find a word for all, like in Latin, omnes, and you will find a word for many, multi. Therefore, those are 2 different things. The many and all is a different thing. Many people in this country are Democrats. Thank God, not all. So, there is a difference. Now, to change the words of consecration from the many to all is a change of significance. Now, the Roman Missal says, in that case, the sacrament doesn't take place. Now, how about the consecration of the bread? It still says, this is my body. Well, we have to apply the principle of the intention again. The Church does not consecrate outside Mass. But if the words of the chalice are invalid, and if the words of the chalice are invalid right away from the start, that means if the words for the consecration of the chalice are invalid in the book, then before Mass starts, you know, or it is evident, you might not know, but it is evident that there will be no consecration of the chalice. If there is no consecration of the chalice, there is no Mass. But as it is not possible to consecrate outside Mass, in that case, even the words of the consecration of the bread are not valid, not because of a defect of form, but because of a defect of intention. If the Church does not consecrate outside Mass, then I cannot have the intention to do what the Church does, if I want to consecrate the bread and not the bread and the chalice and communicate it. You see, to have Mass, it needs three things: consecration of the bread, consecration of the chalice, and communion of the priest, which is the annihilation of the victim, the completeness of the sacrifice. If it is guaranteed that that will not take place, then it is guaranteed it will not be a Mass. If it is guaranteed that it will not be a Mass, there cannot be consecration at all. I have come to the conclusion that the Mass in the vernacular is invalid. However, I cannot give you scientifically irrefutable proof for what I say. Neither could you altogether give me scientifically irrefutable proof that the new Mass in the vernacular is valid. Therefore, we face certainty on doubt. We have the proof that the new Mass is doubtful. And that's why we are not allowed to go to the new Mass, because Blessed Innocent XI condemned the following sentence: "For pastoral reasons you may approach sacraments according to the probability as to its validity." That was condemned. That means if there is doubt, you cannot go. Simple. For those who want to look it up, that's Denzinger Schönmetzer 2101. We cannot and must not approach doubtful sacraments. As far as the new Mass in Latin is concerned, at least if the priest follows the book, if the priest says the so-called Roman canon, and if the priest says the whole Mass in Latin, I cannot see any possible reason to doubt the validity of the Mass, simply because we are facing the same problem that we have with the Masses in the Russian Orthodox Church or the Greek Orthodox Church. Please do not forget, the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox deny the papacy. They deny that the successor of Peter is the supreme head of the Church. They are even much worse than that. They are real heretics. Some people today, because of their delusion with the new liturgy, lean towards the Oriental rites. Well, that's first of all against tradition. Second, they lean towards heresy, because the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox fight each other if they would accept the first 4 councils or the first 7 councils. Big deal. They are heretics anyway. The moment you deny one dogma of the Catholic Church, already you cease to be a Catholic, let alone several councils. So we have to consider the fact that even though the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox are heretics and schismatics, the Catholic Church has always accepted all the 7 sacraments as valid. With the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox, the Catholic Church has always said, decided, and taught that all the 7 sacraments in the Russian Orthodox Church and in the Greek Orthodox Church are to be considered valid. That means they take place, validity. They are all illegitimate because it's schismatics and heretics administering the sacraments, but they're all valid. That means they do take place even though it's not allowed to do it. The same I hold true for the new Mass properly celebrated. I consider the new Mass a schismatic rite. Therefore, it has to be judged according to the principles of judging a schismatic rite. And therefore, I consider it valid because Leo XIII in Apostolici Cura says the following: if a group, a new kind of church, quote unquote, was to change the rites and abbreviate the rites so they would leave out essentials pertaining to the sacrament, and if they would teach the contrary of what is true for the sacrament, then even a validly ordained minister could not celebrate validly with their books. That was the question that had been posed to Leo XIII, because some Anglican bishops secretly got themselves consecrated bishops by Russian Orthodox. They were just bribed. I mean, it's easy. And so they had to answer the question, if I am an Anglican bishop secretly consecrated by a Russian Orthodox bishop, then I'm a validly consecrated bishop. Can I therefore ordain priests in the Anglican rite? No, because the Anglican rite not only as such leaves out essentials of the sacraments, but the Common Prayer Book in its first pages defines heresy. In the first pages of the Common Prayer Book, in some editions in the last pages, it says explicitly that the real presence and the sacrificial priesthood are to be considered popish superstitions. So that's direct heresy, explicit heresy. And that is the difference to the conciliar church. The church, that quote-unquote church, the sect that was a result of Vatican II, never officially denied the real presence or the priesthood. Not officially. Well, most bishops don't believe it. And I don't know if the Pope believes it. It is very difficult to say what the Pope believes. It's very difficult to say what a Pope who kisses a Quran would really believe, except in himself. But on paper, and this is what concerns us, we're not concerned with people here, we're concerned with documents. On paper, the Catholic, the so-called Catholic Church, the counterfeit church, as Father Paul Kramer calls it, the new church, the Novus Ordo Church, or the Church of the New Advent, as our dear Pope calls it, on paper, that sect believes in the real presence and the priesthood. Therefore, one of the two conditions named in Apostolici Curae by Leo XIII does not apply. Because while Pope Paul VI, when he changed the Mass and when he changed the sacraments, he left out some important things, he did not leave out the form, and he never said it is not a sacrament, and he never said it is not true, and he never said it's not a sacrifice. Paul VI was a heretic. He said Mass has the character of a meal. That's heresy. But he never said that Mass does not have the character of a sacrifice. According to Pope Leo XIII, that would be needed in order to invalidate the celebration. And here now we have come a lot closer to the question of ordination. First of all, I already said that Pope Pius XII, when he defined exactly what has to be the form of the ordination to the priesthood and the consecration of a bishop, he only spoke for the Latin Roman Rite. I think that's pretty evident, because he couldn't speak for the Greek Rite. That does not apply to the new schismatic rite. Therefore, we have to examine the form as to its content, as to its message, as to its words. What are the words of the new and the old ordination and the new and the old consecration? Now, first of all, both the ordination to the priesthood in the old rite as the consecration to bishophood in the old rite are not clear. I'm not surprised that the Church needed almost 2,000 years to be able to define what exactly is a bishop and what exactly is the matter of priesthood, because the form doesn't tell you much. It might come as a surprise to you, but it doesn't. Nowhere does it say that you really will become a priest, so in order to celebrate the sacrifice of Mass. See, when the form of priesthood was established, the Council of Trent had not yet defined Holy Mass. And yet it was always valid. And believe it or not, the old form of episcopal consecration is even less clear. You can read it 5 times over, as I did, not know what it is about, except that you receive the Holy Spirit for teaching and preaching, which is mainly the bishop's job. He's the supreme teacher in the diocese. Now, funnily enough, in the new rite, not in Latin, but in the new rite, in the German translation, everything is clear. Receive the spirit of leadership, it says. Well, that's what it is. The first purpose of a priest is to celebrate Mass. The first purpose of a bishop is to lead his diocese. And there it says, spirit of leadership. So as far as the contents of the form are concerned, Paul VI claimed that he just copied an old Byzantine form. I'm not interested if that's the truth or not. The point is, the new form of consecration to the bishophood is clearer than the old one. And the form for the priesthood has hardly changed. The only two changes are, in the old rite, the actual form of consecration. The moment the bishop holds out his hand, says the prayer, and that's when all priests present who have received the imposition of the hands will really become priests. He says, per omnia saecula saeculorum, Amen. Dominus vobiscum et cum spiritu tuo, sursum corda habemus Domino, gratias agamus Domino Deo nostro, dignum et justum est. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's a preface. Now it says, oremus, let us pray. What's the big deal? Nothing, no change. I mean, it's a change in rite. The old one was more beautiful, as usual. But, I mean, it's nothing important taken away. And then they put in an ut. The word ut in Latin has so many meanings that you could consider it a change, but you cannot. And that's the only difference. So, when I asked Bishop Felay, Superior General of the Society of St. Pius X, I asked Father Schmidberger, before that, Superior General of the Society of St. Pius X, I asked Bishop Williamson, I asked Bishop Tissier de Malaret, not because I had doubts, but because I'm a theologian and have to ask questions. They said, what? You want to get yourself reordained? No way. I never wanted to get myself reordained because I never had the slightest doubt whatsoever about my ordination. As I never had the slightest doubt, I did not receive a doubtful sacrament. Therefore, I did not commit that sin that we talked about first regarding Mass. And if I have no doubt about it, then it is not legal to repeat it under condition. If you know you are baptized, you cannot ask for conditional baptism. Impossible. The Church has always denied that. Also, the Church has always given the benefit of doubt. The Church, in doubt, usually will be in favor of validity. In the Code of Canon Law, it says, if there is doubt about the validity of marriage, validity is presumed. Only if you have positive, reasonable doubt, then it is not presumed. But if you go about and say, I wonder if I'm really married, the Church presumes you are married, period. So I never said, I wonder if I'm really a priest. And believe me, that might sound superstitious, but as much as I will never know what a mother is, you will never know what a priest is. A priest sometimes can feel his priesthood, and that's not superstition. Many saints have said that. I know I'm a priest. I have no doubt. So I will never ask for conditional reordination because that's a sacrilege. And the reason why I will never ask for it is not only because I have no doubt, but I have theological evidence that as long, mind my words, as long as the one who will ordain a priest or consecrate a bishop is a bishop himself and administers the sacraments according to the books, old books or new books, but according to the books, he will consecrate validly. We are talking in general, of course. There are cases in which the ordination is not valid, but then the condition I have just given does not apply. Example, recently a priest joined the Society of St. Pius X in Germany. He was, quote-unquote, ordained a priest in the diocese of, not allowed to say. The bishop there changed the rite of ordination to a point that Bishop Felay said we have to do a conditional reordination. That's different then. I've heard the rumor, I haven't seen anything yet, I've heard the rumor that the American Bishops' Conference has come up with a new rite of ordination that would be invalid. Possible. But so far it isn't. Of course, we always had cases in the Church that the sacrament would have to be doubted. That's why the Holy Office had specialists on the validity of sacraments, not just for the last 50 years, but for the last 1500 years. because there were always borderline cases. We always had that. So that hasn't changed. The only problem is anyone who is ordained in the new rite usually is ordained validly, but illegitimately. Now, when I was ordained a priest, November 21st, 1981, in the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, I did not know about this. I was still in the Novus Ordo Church, and I believed everything was glorious and right. But now I know I have been ordained a priest very, very validly, if you could say that, but very, very illegitimately. I don't mean on paper. On paper, I had everything that was needed. I had the permission from the Vicariate of Rome, and the one who ordained me a priest, he was ordained in the old rite himself. The one who ordained me a priest was the vicar of the archpriest of the Basilica of St. Peter's, who would never ordain anybody illicitly. So on paper, according to the new laws, everything was in perfect harmony. But now I understand. I'm a priest for 19 years now, and now I understand that I was ordained in a schismatic